With the UK, Europe's largest financial centre is leaving the EU internal market. Without an EU passport, London becomes less attractive and more than 1,400 billion euros will be withdrawn. The new balance of power has yet to be found and Brussels uses all leverage. When the sun rises on January 1st, the world around the City of London will be different. The London Financial District, which is named after the city centre for historical reasons, is experiencing the greatest turning point in almost 30 years. At the turn of the year, the Brexit transition phase ends. Great Britain is leaving the EU internal market and the exit from the EU's practically complete then. Then British banks and financial service providers lose the so-called EU passport, which allows them to offer their services to EU customers without restrictions. This break will definitely come, no matter how the current struggle for a free trade agreement between London and Brussels ends. There is a lot at stake. The UK financial industry is a giant. It generates more than 130 billion a year, about 7% of gross domestic product. The sector has over 1 million employees, from banking to fund managers. Add another million in related services such as accounting and legal services, and the industry is internationally successful. The UK has a trade deficit with the rest of the world and especially the EU, but not with financial services. They grossed £44 billion in 2018. The strength is also a weakness. Around 40% of the exported financial services are used by EU customers. Brexit doesn't slam the door in their faces, but it does exchange the locks in the door. From 2021, not all keys will fit and hardly anyone wants to risk their key not working anymore. Banks in the city held assets of around £8,000 billion in 2018. About 20% of this was accounted for by European clients or denominated in euros, says John Liver, Brexit expert at EY's auditors. That would be £1,600 billion. EY has calculated that at least 1,200 billion will be moved across the English Channel. That's quite a lot and the story isn't over yet, says Liver. If UK-based banks lose their EU passports, they need a permit from Brussels to attract EU customers. In many cases, this permission for financial service providers from third countries is dependent on the so-called equivalence. British companies from Great Britain are only allowed to offer their services to EU clients if Brussels recognizes London financial regulation in the area that affects the service provider. If that does not happen, the British, in extreme cases, have to leave the island and settle in the EU, where they build, manage and run the business that they offer to customers on the continent. The granting of equivalence can be a political plaything. Switzerland had to find out when Brussels withdrew its recognition from the Swiss Stock Exchange in June 2019, not because of a stock market problem, but rather in the dispute over the framework agreement. In the UK and the EU, financial regulation is currently identical. However, Brussels does not yet want to grant equivalence in many areas. That's understandable when you always hear the thing with the Singapore on the Thames that Boris Johnson brings up all the time again. One exception is the recognition of UK clearing houses to handle trading in derivatives. Oh, that was the German word. Derivatives, it must be in English. Most of the 735,000 billion euros in European derivatives trading is processed in London. 90% of all interest rate swaps denominated in euros are processed there. This market cannot be shifted by regulation. The EU has not granted any equivalence except in clearing where it is necessary to give EU clients access to British infrastructure, says James Bardrick, country manager for Great Britain at Citigroup. The American bank has its headquarters in London for Europe and for a total of 55 countries. Bardrick says it with a certain calm because Citi has organized its dealing with the EU in such a way that the bank is not dependent on equivalence decisions. We have always assumed the worst possible development and planned on this basis. Citi had the advantage of being able to fall back on a network of locations in 21 European countries. Up to 200 new jobs were created in Dublin, Luxembourg, Frankfurt and Paris. Around 60 employees were transferred from London. In Dublin, Citi already operated a commercial bank that was under the supervision of the ECB. A subsidiary in Frankfurt was converted to serve as the investment banking arm, and departments in Spain, Italy and France were also reallocated. Citi was broader than many of its competitors, says Bardrick. It is much easier to build on an existing foundation in a country than to build everything from scratch. EY's auditors have examined the 200 largest financial service providers and come to the following interim conclusion. Overall, around 7,500 jobs have been cut in Great Britain due to Brexit. In addition, 2,800 additional employees are to be hired in Europe. And that was just the banking sector. Don't mix it up with the rest. The most popular locations for relocations are in descending order: Dublin, Luxembourg, Frankfurt and Paris. The feared exodus of bankers from the City of London has not materialized. The capital offers around 400,000 financial jobs. The offices are currently only orphaned because of the corona pandemic and widespread homework. More important is the relocation of assets. If the EU does not recognize UK regulation as equivalent in many cases, not only do many services for EU clients have to be provided from EU territory, the assets have to be located there too. According to EY, large financial service providers have publicly announced shifts in the amount of aforementioned £1,200 billion. Overall, there will be more. Exactly how much is unknown. Big bank Barclays is moving around £150 billion, a tenth of its UK assets, to Dublin. Not only Citi but also other foreign institutes responded. According to Standard & Poor's, JP Morgan Chase has reduced its assets in Great Britain by 5% since the Brexit referendum, Citi by 8%, Goldman Sachs by as much as 22%. In absolute terms, the island still holds about as much American wealth as Germany and France combined, but its importance as a bridgehead to the continent is dwindling. This also applies to Swiss institutes that use the British detour to the EU. UBS has merged its London subsidiary, which is mainly responsible for investment banking, with a Frankfurt branch. To do this, they also obtained legal permission to move assets of up to 32 billion from the Thames to the mine. Less than 200 employees of the approximately 5,000 employees in London were transferred. Credit Suisse, which has a similarly large presence on the Thames, wants to move up to 300 employees. Some will move to Madrid, where the major Swiss bank is setting up its head office for investment banking in the euro area. The EU is trying to achieve self-sufficiency in the financial markets, says Andrew Pilgrim, who at EY has an eye on the British financial sector. The EU does not want to be dependent on a third country and does not only want to have the infrastructure for financial transactions, but also the associated assets. It can use its regulatory leverage for this. Even the already granted recognition of the derivative clearing is limited to 18 months. In Brussels, they hope, assets have their own gravity and can pull the associated services into the EU, said Pilgrim. In other crucial areas too, which do not necessarily depend on equivalence, what Brussels will allow British providers to do is open. For example, in retail banking, where British institutions have to block the accounts and cards of those customers who are EU residents, in investment banking, and also on the question of the how long European Investment Fund can still be managed from the UK. UK fund managers have assets of £8,500 billion under their wing. Of this, 2,100 billion are registered in the EU but monitored from London. The EU wants to strengthen control over the delegation of fund management, says EY expert John Liver. These are the decisions that will shape the future of the industry. The game about future equilibrium is still going on. This is where the hotly contested free trade agreement comes into play, although it itself will hardly contain any relief for the financial industry. But if there is an agreement, the EU will find it much easier to grant equivalence, says Andrew Pilgrim of EY. It is true that, according to widespread belief, The British financial sector is well equipped to exit the domestic market, and it was often forced to do so when a no-deal scenario loomed for the first time in March 2019. But in 2021, the institutes will shift the focus from the tactical reaction to Brexit to a strategic realignment, says John Liver. Then London will have to prove itself anew, but it has strengths. I cannot imagine a time when we will not have a very important globally operating agency in London, says country manager James Bardrick. For Citi and many of its competitors, coming to London had nothing to do with the EU. When the single market came along, the EU passport created a good way of serving European markets from here, said Bardrick. But London has always been a global centre of trade. He could not imagine that the business controlled from London would not be part of the core of the US bank, which had 8,500 employees on the British island. It would be quite difficult to find someone who is concerned about London's future as a global financial centre, regardless of what the Brexit negotiations and equivalence decisions result, says EY expert Andrew Pilgrim. The standard assumption is that London will defend its global role, and the European branches in Dublin, Luxembourg, Frankfurt or Paris primarily serve European clients with products registered in the EU, adds John Liver. How big the European pull will be remains to be seen. The cosmopolitan city of London still has the world language English. The right time zone is the bridge in transatlantic exchange trading and the cluster effect. The large ecosystem of international bankers, lawyers, accountants and PR specialists. The UK financial industry will not stand still either, but will try to innovate and defend its leading position. London policy is likely to be more pragmatic than the EU. And before someone tries to find a hidden meaning in that one, that was just a mere observation, and it will be if that comes true. It's not about good or bad, which side is better than the other. It's just a different approach. Great Britain is already negotiating market access for financial service providers with Switzerland, which can live well even without the EU stock exchange equivalence. The mutual recognition of the stock exchanges will not be a problem either. British bankers are tough, but these cuddles should have been welcome. Financial service providers are a central part of the economic recovery after the corona crisis. And after Brexit, Great Britain's role as an outstanding international open financial centre must be strengthened. That's what Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak said when he presented his vision for the future of the site in November. Digital currencies, green government bonds, easier IPOs for tech companies. Sunak named topics that were well received in the industry. The hurdle was low, however, because the financial sector, one of the most important British economic sectors, is likely to have felt largely ignored in the Brexit negotiations. The previous government under Theresa May gave up in mid-2018 to fight for privileged access for the sector to the EU internal market, also because Brussels made it clear that there would be no alternative to the standard model, that means to the equivalence decisions. And since the global financial crisis, the industry's reputation among the British population has been too poor for it to be advisable to publicly complain of disregard. Unlike Brussels, Downing Street does not pursue the tactic of denying domestic companies and client access to services from the other side of the English Channel by failing to make equivalence decision. London will recognize European financial regulation as equivalent in very many cases, confirmed Sunak. This enables British financial service providers continue to use European stock exchanges, clearing houses, investment firms or rating agencies. And before you start complaining, then the EU has to do the same thing. Singapore on the Thames. That I have to remind you of, because that is the whole reason, the plans that Boris Johnson brought up for the future, why they really have to keep that sealed. For the time being, London has to wait for an equivalent gift from Brussels. And if you want to stay informed, please subscribe to my channel. Please subscribe to my other two new channels. I'll see you in my next video. Viel Spaß!